Mateo López never considered himself an important man, but his hands told a different story. They were the hands of a cook, calloused by the heat of the stove and precise in the handling of knives, capable of transforming simple ingredients into dishes that warmed the soul. He was the beating heart of La Cocina de Alma, a small fonda nestled in the dusty streets of Tijuana, a refuge of flavors and comfort amid the harshness of the 1990s. His story is a dark echo that crosses decades, a reminder that even the most peaceful man carries a limit within him, and what happens when that limit is brutally crossed. I ask that if this story resonates with you, you help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Comment from which city you are watching, so we know how far these voices from the past can travel. His path to that point was a chronicle of honest work and unconditional love. From a young age, Mateo found in cooking a form of expression, a way to nourish and care for those around him. The fonda was not just his livelihood, it was a sanctuary, a legacy built with the sweat of his brow and the passion of his wife, Sophia. The walls of the small restaurant had witnessed the growth of his daughter, Isabella, whose laughter was the main spice in every dish that left his kitchen. There, in that modest space, Mateo was not just a cook, he was a guardian of memories, a pillar of his community, and above all, a man who believed in the goodness and simplicity of life. Every morning began with the same sacred ritual, the smell of onions browning in oil, the rhythmic sound of a knife chopping fresh cilantro, and the familiar warmth of the industrial stove. For Mateo, these were the sounds of peace, the symphony of a life well lived. He would watch Sophia set the tables with a smile that lit up the room, while little Isabella, at 5 years old, drew on napkins, creating fantastical worlds amidst the restaurant's daily routine. It was a complete universe, self-sufficient in its happiness. Mateo felt a deep gratitude for that routine, a sense of fulfillment that made him believe that, despite the growing shadow of violence looming over Tijuana, his little world was safe, protected by love and hard work. The working-class neighborhood where they lived was a microcosm of struggle and resilience. People knew each other by name, doors were rarely locked, and the community functioned as an extended family. Mateo was a central figure in this ecosystem. He would sell on credit to those in need, offer a bowl of hot soup to the destitute, and always had a word of comfort for the afflicted. His fonda was more than a place to eat. It was a meeting point, an oasis of normalcy in a city that was beginning to bend under the weight of fear imposed by the factions. He embodied the decency of the common man, believing that solidarity and mutual respect were stronger shields than any weapon. Mateo's relationship with his knives was almost spiritual. He knew them by their weight, their balance, by the way the blade behaved against the fiber of a piece of meat or the delicacy of a vegetable. They were extensions of his will, tools of creation. He taught Isabella the difference between the cut for a stew and the one for a ceviche, explaining that every movement had a purpose, an intention. The respect he had for his tools reflected his worldview. Everything deserved care, precision, and above all, a constructive purpose. His hands, which so skillfully gave life to food, were a symbol of his identity, of his unwavering belief in the power to nurture, not to destroy. However, the tranquility of his existence was a fragile illusion. Whispers about the protection fee began to spread like a silent plague through the neighborhood streets. Neighboring shopkeepers would appear with sunken eyes and a palpable fear, handing envelopes of cash to grim-faced men in unmarked cars. Mateo, in his faith in righteousness and hard work, refused to believe that such evil could reach his sanctuary. He saw the fear corroding the backbone of his community, but he clung to the idea that if he didn't provoke anyone, if he continued to be the honest man he had always been, the darkness would pass by his door, never daring to enter. The tension manifested in small details. The sudden silence when certain men entered a bar, the averted gazes of his neighbors, the rush to close up shops before nightfall. The neighborhood's atmosphere, once vibrant and welcoming, was becoming heavy, oppressive. Mateo felt this change in the air, a chill that not even the heat of his stove could completely dissipate. He held Sophia tighter at night and lingered a little longer when putting Isabella to bed, singing lullabies in a whisper, as if trying to create an invisible barrier of love around them, a last, desperate attempt to shield their happiness from the encroaching violence. On that fateful night, the smell of carne asada and fresh tortillas still hung in the air, a testament to the Lopez family's last happy dinner. After closing the fonda, Mateo sat with Sophia and Isabella, sharing stories and laughter under the dim light of the kitchen. It was a moment of crystalline perfection, one of those instances that memory freezes forever. He looked at the faces of his wife and daughter, the love he felt for them so vast and deep it ached. In that brief instant of peace, he allowed himself to believe that everything would be all right, that their love was an impenetrable shield. It was the last moment of innocence before hell invaded his paradise and transformed the cook into a weapon. The peace of that night was shattered by the sound of a boot kicking in the back door of the kitchen. Two men, their faces seemingly carved by cruelty, invaded Mateo's sanctuary. They weren't the bosses, just the guard dogs of the faction, but their empty eyes and the sadistic smirk of their leader, a man known as El Sombra, were enough to freeze the blood in one's veins. The air, once filled with the aroma of home, became heavy, fetid with the presence of death. The leader of the small group, in a raspy voice, got straight to the point, demanding the first protection fee. He described the payment not as a choice, but as a condition for the beauty of that family scene to be repeated the next day, a veiled threat that hung over the heads of Sophia and Isabella. Fear paralyzed Mateo for an instant, an ice that shot up his spine. He looked at Sophia's terrified face as she held Isabella tightly, and something inside him broke. It wasn't courage, but a visceral refusal to let that filth touch his family. With a calmness he himself didn't understand, Mateo stood up. His voice, though trembling, was firm. He said no. It wasn't a shout of defiance, but the declaration of a man who had built his world with dignity and would not bow to evil. He explained that his money was the fruit of his labor, for the sustenance of his family, and not to feed the greed of criminals. In that moment he sealed his fate, choosing honor over submission. The response to his no was immediate and disproportionate. Violence erupted in the small kitchen with the fury of a lightning bolt. It was swift, brutal, and merciless. Mateo was thrown against a spice rack, the smell of cumin and pepper filling the air as he watched, helpless. His knives, his tools of creation, remained untouched on the wall, silent witnesses to the horror. He saw the unthinkable. The sanctuary where he taught his daughter to knead dough became a sacrificial altar. The sound of gunshots echoed among the stainless steel pots, and the laughter of his family was replaced by an eternal, deafening silence. Mateo López's world collapsed in an instant of absolute cruelty. Left alive to suffer, Mateo knelt on the cold kitchen floor, the metallic smell of blood overpowering all others. He crawled to the bodies of Sophia and Isabella, his silent screams tearing at his throat. In that devastating silence, the raw pain began to transform into something darker, sharper. A silent promise was made to the souls of his wife and daughter. Justice would not come from the police or from God. It would come from his own hands. It is in moments like these that a person's true nature is forged in fire. If you have ever felt the flame of helplessness turn into determination, you will understand the journey that begins now. Subscribe to follow this quest for retribution and help his voice echo, showing that some debts can only be paid in blood. When the police finally arrived, led by the cynical detective Varga, they found a hollow man. Mateo answered their questions in monosyllables, his eyes fixed on a stain on the wall. He saw the bureaucracy, the lack of will, the impotent acceptance of the brutality that ruled the city. In that instant, he realized he was completely alone. The system would not save him. In fact, it had abandoned him long before that night. As the officers cordoned off the area, Mateo looked at the distorted reflection of his face in a pool of blood on the floor. The man staring back at him was a stranger, a mask of grief, with eyes that burned with a cold, lethal purpose. The cook was dead. What remained was only the beginning of a dark legend. The days following the funeral were a blur of silence and dust. Mateo locked the door to the fonda, leaving behind the ghost of his former life. The restaurant, once a place of warmth and laughter, became a cold mausoleum, the smell of spices replaced by the stagnant odor of tragedy. He moved into a small apartment on the most forgotten side of the city, a single room with a window overlooking an endless alley. The bare walls and concrete floor reflected the emptiness that had settled in his soul. He didn't cook, barely ate. The hunger that consumed him was not for food, but for a retribution he hardly knew how to begin, a vengeance that was the only thing keeping him breathing. With a cold determination, he sold the fonda and everything inside for a fraction of its worth. Every object sold was a piece of his old life being torn away, but Mateo felt no pain, only a functional numbness. The money, stained by the memory of all he had lost, became his only tool. He delved into Tijuana's underworld, a universe of informants and petty criminals operating in the shadows. He learned to listen, to observe, and to pay for the silence of others. His first purchase was not a weapon, but a name. The name of the man who led the attack on his kitchen, a low-ranking enforcer, but the first link in the chain he intended to break, one by one. The preparation for his first hunt was methodical, almost obsessive. Mateo used the discipline the kitchen had taught him. Just as he studied a recipe, he studied his target's life. He learned his roots, his vices, his moments of vulnerability. He would spend hours sitting in his car, watching the image of his wife and daughters, faces burning in his mind, fueling the furnace of his hatred. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford, as it brought nightmares that returned him to that blood-soaked kitchen. The vigil, on the other hand, offered a clear, singular purpose: to wait for the right moment to extinguish the first of the 25 lives that were owed to him. He cornered him in a narrow, fetid alley, far from any witnesses. Mateo's first act of violence lacked the elegance of a professional killer. It was clumsy, brutal, and viscerally personal. He used the butcher knife he had saved from the fonda, the same one he had used to cut the meat for his family's last dinner. The confrontation was a desperate struggle. The man was bigger, stronger, but Mateo was driven by a fury that transcended physical pain. In the end, when the body fell inert to the ground, Mateo felt no triumph, only the crushing weight of what he had become. The silence of the alley was broken by the sound of him vomiting, his body expelling the horror of his first step into the abyss. The trembling in his hands wouldn't stop. He leaned against the wall, the bitter taste of bile in his mouth, another man's blood on his clothes. A part of him screamed in despair. The cook, the husband, the father, horrified by the monstrosity of his act. But then he closed his eyes and saw Isabella laughing, saw Sophia's smile. Their memory was no longer a comfort, it was a command. The pain of their absence was infinitely greater than the horror of his actions. He understood in that moment that there was no turning back. The path to peace was blocked. The only way forward was paved with the bodies of those who destroyed his world. That man on the ground was just the beginning. That night, I crossed a line within myself, one of those from which you can never return. We ask ourselves how far we would go for the ones we love, and sometimes the answer terrifies us. Once you take that step, the only way is forward. No matter how dark it becomes. If you have ever had to make a choice that changed you forever, that redefined who you were, I ask that you support this channel. Your subscription is a sign that, even on the loneliest and darkest journeys, we are not completely alone. It's a reminder that our stories, no matter how difficult, deserve to be told. The second target was different. Mateo learned from the brutality of his first experience. Blind passion gave way to a cold efficiency. He began to use his unique knowledge, the mental map that every cook has of the city. He knew the bread delivery schedules, the routes of meat suppliers, the service alleys behind restaurants that were invisible to most. He no longer needed a direct confrontation. He could predict his targets' movements, isolate them in their own environments, using the city's routine as his weapon. The hunt became a chess game, and Tijuana was his board, a labyrinth that only he fully understood. The second death was clean, quick, and silent, carried out in a delivery yard before dawn. The target, a collector for the faction, was waiting for a vegetable truck, but found Mateo instead. This time, there was no struggle, only surprise and a sudden end. Mateo felt the pulse of life drain away under his hands, and though the revulsion was still there, it was buried beneath layers of a frigid determination. He was becoming a predator, adapting his skills for a new kind of craft. The precision he used to debone a chicken was now applied to dissecting the criminal organization that took everything from him, one member at a time, with a terrifying calm. Soon, the whispers began. The bodies of known faction members started appearing in discreet locations, always with precise wounds made by a professional-grade blade. The press, hungry for sensationalism, dubbed the unknown killer El Cocinero Justiciero, the Vigilante cook. The name caught fire in the neighborhood. To the oppressed community, he was not a monster, but an avenging angel, a ghost emerging from the shadows to settle the scores the law refused to address. Mateo, isolated in his apartment, heard the news without emotion. The legend didn't matter to him. For him, it was just a gruesome shopping list, and he was methodically crossing off the items. The wave of killings caught the attention of Detective Varga. Cynical and weary from years of fighting a losing battle against organized crime, he initially saw the cases as a simple gang war. However, something bothered him. There was none of the typical bravado of cartel executions. The deaths were discreet, almost surgical. The murder weapon, apparently a high-quality knife, was unusual. Varga began to profile the killer, someone with discipline, knowledge of the territory, and a powerful motive. He didn't have a face for the ghost yet, but he felt he wasn't hunting an ordinary criminal, but something far more personal and dangerous. As he crossed more names off his list, the weight on his soul became unbearable. The nightmares were relentless, mixing his daughter's laughter with the last gasps of his victims. In a moment of weakness, he sought out the only pillar of his old life that still remained, the old neighborhood church. He didn't go seeking forgiveness, for he knew he was beyond redemption. He sought out Father Ramirez, the man who had baptized him and officiated his wedding. He needed to look into the eyes of someone who knew the man he used to be, perhaps to reassure himself that that man still existed somewhere beneath the layers of hatred and blood. The meeting in the confessional was tense, heavy with a silent charge. Mateo did not confess his crimes in words, but his eyes, empty and haunted, told the whole story. Father Ramirez, with the wisdom of decades spent listening to the darkest secrets of the human soul, sensed the darkness emanating from him. He did not condemn him. Instead, he pleaded with Mateo to stop, to not let the monster of vengeance consume what was left of his humanity. "Justice belongs to God, my son," the priest whispered. "What you seek is only more darkness." Mateo heard the words, but they found no echo in his heart. He stood up and left, leaving the priest to pray for a soul already lost. The rising body count left El Sombra furious and paranoid. His men, once feared predators, were now looking over their shoulders, afraid of the shadows. The faction leader couldn't understand who would dare challenge him in his own territory. He began to doubt everyone, punishing failures with even greater brutality, which only increased the climate of fear and mistrust within his own organization. The hunt for the cocinero became his personal obsession. He wanted the ghost's head, not just to stop his losses, but to reassert his power and crush the symbol of resistance the mysterious vigilante had become to the people. It was in this climate of fear that Mateo found an unexpected ally. Elena, the owner of a small grocery store, saw Mateo's transformation. She saw the kind, smiling man become a thin, silent shadow, driven by a pain she also knew, as the faction had taken her brother years before. One day, as Mateo was buying coffee, she casually mentioned the new hideout of one of El Sombra's henchmen, disguising the information as neighborhood gossip. It was a subtle but profound act, a gesture of complicity, the silent support of the oppressed community, which saw in Mateo not a murderer, but the embodiment of their own thirst for justice. Using Elena's information, Mateo planned his next execution. This time, the target was more important, a man trusted by El Sombra. The operation was more complex, requiring infiltration of a warehouse that served as a front for the faction. With each step, each death, the task became less an act of passion and more a function, a grim routine. The cook's heart, which once warmed with his daughter's smile, now beat to a cold, steady rhythm, the metronome of his revenge. He eliminated the target with the efficiency of a spectre, disappearing into the night before the body was found. The legend of the cocinero grew, and so did the faction's fear. Meanwhile, Detective Varga, frustrated by the lack of leads, decided to revisit cold cases. He came across the brutal murder of the López family, a crime that had been quickly shelved due to the faction's notorious influence. He read the report, noting that the attack occurred after the restaurant owner refused to pay for protection. Varga looked at the map of his investigation, at the locations where the bodies of faction members had been found. They were all in the same area. Service alleys, delivery yards, places a cook would know like the back of his hand. A terrible and unlikely idea began to form in his mind. Mateo felt the net closing in. El Sombra's paranoia made his targets more unpredictable, and whispers about Varga's investigation warned him of a new danger. He was no longer just the hunter. Now, he was also the prey. This new reality forced him to be even more meticulous, to dive deeper into the shadows, to become a true ghost in his own city. He constantly changed hiding places, communicated through codes, and lived in a state of perpetual alertness. The journey, which had begun with an explosion of pain, had turned into a war of attrition, a silent battle fought in the alleys and on the rooftops of Tijuana. There comes a moment when you look in the mirror, and the face staring back is that of a stranger. The hands that once made bread for your family now only know the cold of steel and the warmth of blood. The path of vengeance has a price. It costs you the person you once were. It's a lonely road, and knowing that someone, somewhere, is listening to this story, knowing that you've subscribed and you are here, brings a strange kind of comfort. It means that even at the end of everything, the reasons we started still matter. It means my story, and maybe a small part of yours, will not be forgotten. El Sombra's luck finally changed. In a miscalculated attack, Mateo was surprised by a lookout. The confrontation was swift, and though Mateo was victorious, his target managed to escape, gravely wounded. The man survived long enough to give his boss the first real description of the killer, not a demon or a soldier from a rival cartel, but an ordinary middle-aged man with eyes that burned with sadness and hatred. A man who moved with the purpose of someone with nothing left to lose. The description was vague, but for El Sombra, it was like turning on a light in a dark room. The ghost had a face. With this new information, Varga returned to the abandoned fonda. The place was covered in dust and cobwebs, a monument frozen in time. He walked through the kitchen, imagining the crime scene, the life that had been brutally extinguished there. Behind an old calendar on the wall, he found a family photo that had been overlooked. In it, a smiling Mateo hugged his wife and daughter. Varga looked at the eyes of the man in the photo, kind eyes, full of life. Then he thought of the survivor's description, a man with sad, hateful eyes. In that instant, the unbelievable truth hit him with the force of a punch. The vigilante and the victim were the same man. The city held its breath. The hunt had become a three-way perfect storm. Mateo, now with less than half his list to complete, hunted the remaining faction members with a renewed urgency. Ella Sombra, armed with a description and a blind fury, hunted the man who dared to defy him, turning the neighborhood upside down in search of his tormentor. And Detective Varga, now morally certain of the killer's identity, hunted Mateo, torn between his duty to uphold the law and a reluctant admiration for the terrible, poetic justice being served. Mateo's vengeance demanded a bolder step. His next target was El Sombra's right-hand man, someone who rarely exposed himself, protected in the heart of a bar that served as the faction's headquarters. An alleyway attack wouldn't be possible. Mateo would have to enter the serpent's nest. He spent days planning, disguising himself as a delivery man, studying the gaps in security, the guards' routines. The plan was risky, almost suicidal. For the first time since his journey began, he felt a flicker of fear, not of death, but of the possibility of failing before completing his mission. The execution of the plan was a symphony of tension and silent violence. Using the chaos of the bar's kitchen during peak hours, Mateo managed to infiltrate the restricted areas. The confrontation with El Sombra's right-hand man was swift and lethal, taking place in a cold storage room between sacks of beans and crates of peppers. However, his exit was complicated. A silent alarm was triggered. Mateo had to fight his way out, getting wounded in the arm during the desperate escape. He barely made it, leaving behind chaos and the certainty, for El Sombra, that his enemy was fallible. He bled like any other man. The death of his most trusted man pushed El Sombra to the brink of madness. Blind with rage, he abandoned all pretense of subtlety. He ordered his men to terrorize the neighborhood, beating merchants and ransacking homes in search of any clue about the cocinero. The indiscriminate violence spread like a wildfire, punishing the innocent in his search for the guilty. Elena, the grocer, was brutally interrogated, her store vandalized as a warning to anyone helping the enemy. The community, which had once silently supported the vigilante, now suffered the direct consequences of his actions. Hiding and tending to his wound, Mateo heard the stories of the terror descending upon his neighborhood. He learned what happened to Elena, of the families being punished because of him. A new, torturous dimension of his internal conflict emerged. His personal quest for vengeance was now inflicting pain on the very community he had once nurtured and protected. Justice for his family was creating injustice for many others. In that moment of agony, he realized he could no longer hide in the shadows, picking off his targets one by one. He needed to cut off the serpent's head. The hunt had to end, and it would end with El Sombra. The final hour of reckoning had arrived. Mateo knew he had to lure El Sombra to his own territory, to the epicenter of his pain. After eliminating the second-to-last name on his list, he left a macabre message on the body, a small menu from La Cocina de Alma, stained with the victim's blood. The message was unmistakable. Upon hearing the news, El Sombra finally connected all the dots. His initial fury gave way to incredulous shock, which quickly twisted into a sadistic smile. The cook, the ghost haunting him, was the insignificant man whose life he had crushed on a whim. The irony pleased him. Accepting the challenge, he decided to go to the abandoned restaurant alone, driven by an arrogance that prevented him from seeing the cook as anything more than an insect to be crushed. Mateo entered his old kitchen for the first time in months. The place was steeped in darkness and silence, a tomb for his memories. The moonlight filtering through a grimy window revealed the dust that covered everything like a shroud. He could feel the presence of Sophia and Isabella in every corner, a painful echo of lost happiness. He ran his fingers over the cold steel counter where Sophia used to prepare salads, and then over the small chair where Isabella would sit to draw. This place, the stage of his greatest joy and his annihilation, would also be the stage of his consummation. With a deliberate calm, he began to prepare the scene, not with ingredients, but with traps, turning his sanctuary into a death arena. El Sombra came through the back door, the same one his men had kicked in on that fateful night. He found Mateo standing in the center of the kitchen, illuminated only by the moon. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other, the silence heavy with the weight of all that had happened. It was El Sombra who broke it with a scornful laugh. "So it was you all along," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "A cook, a pathetic cook, cost me 24 men." Mateo didn't answer. His eyes, however, spoke for him. They were pits of suffering so deep it had transformed into a terrifying calm, the calm of a man who had already died inside and had nothing left to fear. The violence exploded without warning. El Sombra, relying on his brute strength, charged forward, but Mateo was in his element. He moved through the kitchen with a ghostly fluidity, using every object as an extension of his body and his fury. He kicked over a sack of flour to momentarily blind his adversary, used a heavy iron skillet to parry a blow, and retaliated with brutal precision. He slammed El Sombra against the industrial stove, the sound of the impact echoing through the empty space. The fight wasn't about technique, but about instinct and environment. The cook, who once used this space to create, now used it to deconstruct his enemy, piece by piece, in a macabre and savage dance. The battle intensified, becoming a duel of blades. El Sombra drew a combat machete, a cruel and intimidating weapon. Mateo, retreating to the wall, reached out and took his old butcher knife from its magnetic strip. The sound of clashing steel filled the kitchen, each spark illuminating their faces. Contorted with hatred and pain. It was more than a fight. It was a symbolic confrontation. Mateo's blade, a tool of nourishment, now faced El Sombra's weapon, an instrument of terror. Every move Mateo made was precise, efficient, the result of years of cutting and slicing, a deadly skill he never knew he possessed until hatred sharpened it. With a swift, clever move, Mateo used the handle of a pot to trap El Sombra's armed hand, twisting it with a strength born of desperation. The machete clattered to the floor. In an instant, he had him subdued, pinning him to the exact spot where his family had been executed. El Sombra, the all-powerful faction leader, now looked up with eyes wide with panic. The predator turned prey. In that crucial moment, Mateo's transformation was complete. There was no victory cry, no speech of vengeance. He looked into the eyes of the man who had stolen his soul, and, with the cold efficiency of someone finishing a job, he drove the butcher knife home, putting an end to his hunt. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any sound. El Sombra's body lay motionless on the stained floor. Mateo stood, his chest heaving, the adrenaline draining from his body, leaving a crushing void in its place. The flame of vengeance, which had consumed him and kept him on his feet for so long, was finally extinguished, leaving only the cold ashes of his pain. He looked around the wrecked kitchen, a reflection of his own ruined life. The list was complete. All 25 names had been crossed off. Justice, or whatever it was, had been done. But there was no peace, no relief, only the deafening silence of a man alone in the hell he had created. The first light of dawn seeped into the kitchen, its weak, grey rays illuminating the carnage. Mateo didn't move. He remained standing, a statue of grief amidst the desolation. The vengeance he had imagined would bring some kind of catharsis or relief offered him nothing. The hatred that drove him was like a fuel that once spent left behind only a cold, useless engine. The ghosts of Sophia and Isabella were not there to embrace or absolve him. The silence in the kitchen was the same silence of his apartment, the same silence of his heart. He had exterminated the monsters that haunted him, only to discover that the biggest monster now resided within him, and this one he could not kill. His hand trembled as he picked up the butcher knife from the floor. The blade, stained and dull, reflected a distorted version of his face. He forced himself to look, to face the final result of his journey. The man in the reflection was a stranger. The hollowed cheeks, the unshaven beard, but it was the eyes that terrified him. They were two shards of broken glass, devoid of any light, any warmth. The spark of the loving father, the devoted husband, the passionate cook, it had all been extinguished. He didn't recognize that face, didn't recognize that soul. In his quest for vengeance, he had methodically dismantled himself, and now there was nothing left to rebuild. The price of his justice was his own identity. Without looking back, Mateo López walked out of the kitchen and onto the street. The city of Tijuana was waking up, the first sounds of the day breaking the pre-dawn silence. He walked aimlessly, a ghost in the daylight. No one noticed him. He was just another anonymous face in the crowd. He took nothing with him, for there was nothing to take. His old life was ash, and his new life had no future. He kept walking until the familiar streets became strange, until the sun was high in the sky, and then he simply vanished. The man dissolved into the urban landscape, leaving behind only a story, a whisper, the dark legend of El Cocinero Justiciero. When Detective Varga arrived at the crime scene, he wasn't surprised. He found El Sombra's body and the silent kitchen. He knew who had done it, and in an act of unofficial justice, he closed the case as gang-related, unsolved. The faction's tyranny over the neighborhood crumbled with the death of its leader. The community breathed a cautious sigh of relief, free from daily fear, but forever haunted by the violence it had witnessed. Mateo's story became part of the local folklore, told in low voices in bars and markets, a cautionary tale about a good man pushed too far, a hero to some, a monster to others, and a ghost to all. He got his revenge, but lost himself forever in the process. Mateo's story ends here, not with a resolution, but with the echo of a shattered soul. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this dark journey. Your presence, the act of subscribing and following, is what allows these voices, often forgotten by time, to be heard. It is what ensures that stories like Mateo's, stories of love, loss, and the terrible price sometimes paid for justice, are never truly erased by the darkness. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering.